I'd like to welcome everyone to another AFINet webinar. And as you know, AFINet is an organization that tries to bring together researchers, experts by experience, policymakers, and anyone else who is interested in promoting the well-being of family members affected by addiction. We are a small-scale charity, and more information can be found on our website. And if you're not a member already, you can become a member by application there as well, and membership is free. And the webinar started when the pandemic happened, and they have been regularly they took place regularly on a monthly basis, thanks to Richard Wellman, who is the key organizer of all this. And they wouldn't be possible without the aid of Emmy Kaupila, who is organizing the technical background of today's webinar. And as you have noticed in the announcement, all webinars are free, but since we are a small-scale charity, we would, of course, welcome donations since we have no regular income. And I would also like to announce that next year in June, there will be an AFINet conference, hopefully face-to-face in Rotterdam. This will take place from June 15 to 17. And abstract submission will be possible in January and February, and we will send out calls for abstracts most likely in about 1 month of time. But for today, I am very happy to introduce Jeremy Segrott. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And Jeremy is a senior lecturer at the Decipher Center and Center for Trials Research at Cardiff University. And his research interests concern the evaluation of parenting and family-based interventions, including those linking schools and families. He has expertise in conducting process evaluations to understand the mechanisms through which interventions work and the factors shaping their implementation. In addition, he has a keen interest in public involvement in the research process, and he has an academic lead for public involvement in the Decipher Center. And today, he will present some data on the effectiveness of the Strengthening Families program in the UK at preventing substance misuse in 10 to 14-year-olds, which will be a pragmatic randomized controlled trial. And we are very interested about the findings you're going to present, and I'll hand over to Jeremy. After his talk, there will be a space, of course, for debate, and we're looking forward to your questions. You can write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand after the talk. Over to you, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to come and speak to you today. So, because I'm not very good at multitasking, I'm going to try and share the screen and then carry on talking. Okay, so can I just check that you can all see the screen as you would expect to see it for a PowerPoint presentation?
Looks perfect.
Okay, that's great. Just to say, yes, that I'm based at Cardiff University in Wales. I work across two centres, the Centre for Trials Research, which is our clinical trials unit, and also then the Decipher Centre at Cardiff University. And in both centres, I'm very interested in the health and well-being of young people and the role of both families, parenting, and school-based approaches. And today I'm going to present to you the findings from a randomised controlled trial that we conducted in Wales. And the name of the project, Project SFP Cymru, so Strengthening Families Programme. So this was a randomised controlled trial of the Strengthening Families Programme 1014 UK. And I had to remember that to explain that word Cymru there is not an acronym, and Cymru is the Welsh word for Wales. So Project SFP Cymru, reflecting where we undertook the project. The other thing I'd like to do just right at the start is just to acknowledge all of the people who you see named here in the first slide. So this was a big team, and I'm presenting the work here of a large number of people today. I'm going to divide my presentation into 5 main parts, and essentially I'm going to give you a complete overview of the study. I'll begin with a little bit of background information. I'll go through the trial design and how it was implemented, so how we conducted the trial. And then in terms of the findings, I'll split that into 2 parts, starting with the process evaluation. So I'll tell you something about how the program was implemented and the extent to which it was implemented as intended. And against that context, then I'll go through the main trial findings, and then finally I'll provide a summary of the trial findings overall, and perhaps indicate some areas for discussion at the end. Now, I feel fairly sure that much of what's on this slide you all know far more than I do, but just to kind of set the study in its context. Obviously, we know that families are an important part of what we look at when we think about risk and protective factors in relation to young people's substance misuse, and that's very much what we're about in this study, is trying to looking at the prevention of substance misuse by young people, and recognizing that family relationships are important protective factors, and therefore they're an important target for intervention. And I've kept these last 3 bullet points in from a presentation that I gave quite a while ago, just to kind of again set the scene and the context for this study, which began about 10 years ago now. Firstly, the governmental and policy interest in family support and interventions. It was strong then, and I guess it's still strong now. And hopefully things have improved, but certainly when we were developing the study, many interventions that sought to prevent substance misuse and were kind of parent or family based, and sometimes being implemented without rigorous evaluation, and most of the evidence base dominated by interventions and evaluations from the USA. And one of the sort of purposes of our study was to take an intervention that had been brought over from the USA, had been culturally adapted for the UK, and to look at its effectiveness in a UK setting. Let me tell you a bit about the Strengthening Families Programme 1014, for those of you that are not familiar with it. It's a universal substance misuse prevention intervention delivered to groups of families with children aged 10 to 14, hence the name SFP 1014. It focuses on aspects of parenting, family functioning, and young people's peer pressure resistance skills. And so I guess it's quite unusual, or certainly it was during the time of the study, that it's an intervention that's delivered to both parents and their children and young people who attend the intervention together. It has various kind of theoretical frameworks that provide the basis of the intervention and its design, including the biopsychosocial model, family process model, resiliency model, and social ecology model. So, for instance, looks at how aspects of family relationships can buffer aspects of stress within the family. So, a theoretically informed intervention. And there's extensive evidence from the United States that the intervention is effective in delaying the initiation of substance use, and levels of use, and that comes from mostly from the trials led by Richard Spoth in Iowa State. And as I've already said, the intervention SFP 1014 has been adapted for use in the UK. And this is what the program looks like when it's delivered. So, as I say, it's delivered to groups of families, so parents and their children, aged 10 to 14. It takes place over 7 weekly sessions. In the first hour, the parents and young people are in separate groups, and the focus of the first hour is mainly on skills development And then in the second hour of each week, the parents and young people come together and they work as both as a whole group and as family units to practice the skills that they've learned. And particularly in the parents' hour, there's extensive use of videos. I'll give you then a bit of background to the trial that I'm presenting the results of to you today. And one of the things that began to um, one of the kind of I guess the rationales for our study was some initial work that I was involved with for the Welsh Government that looked at the implementation of the Strengthening Families programme in Cardiff, where it was being implemented, and that work looked at its potential as a national programme for Wales. And based on that work and other kind of decisions, the Welsh Government agreed to provide funding for SFP, Strengthening Families Programme, in 3 locations, 3 counties in Wales. They agreed that the programme funding would be as part of a trial. They included resources for training and mentoring to the delivery teams. And we, as a research team, put together an application to the National Prevention Research Initiative, which was supported by Welsh Government. And as part of our funding application, we secured funds both for the research trial and programme delivery in 3 additional locations, as I say, from the MPRI. So we were very fortunate to have very valuable support and partnership working with government as part of this trial. The trial itself, which we named Project SFP Cymru, was a pragmatic RCT with families as the unit of randomisation. And by pragmatic, what I mean here is that we sought to evaluate the intervention being implemented in as near to real world conditions as we could, so that we could really maximise the external and generalisability of the trial findings. Our target size for the trial was 756 families across 7 sites, and we had embedded process and economic evaluations within the trial. And in a minute, I'll tell you a bit about the process evaluation. And in this trial, we were comparing normal care, whatever that might be, in the control group with normal care plus SFP 1014 families that were randomised to the intervention arm. The programme was delivered by charities and local government agencies, and the implementation systems were very much designed to mirror how these kind of programmes would normally be delivered, and so thus kind of reflecting real world conditions. And we were doing an RCT within a community setting, and we had researchers embedded in the delivery teams during the recruitment process. Now, one aspect of the trial that I'd just like to dwell on for a minute, and I'll be returning to this towards the end of the presentation, is the group composition strategy that the programme adopted. And I've already said that the programme SFP 1014 had been adapted, and the kind of the initial work that we did as a research team was looking at how the adapted UK programme was delivered in Cardiff. And I guess this piece of work forms, I guess, part of a broader set of studies, some of which were led by Oxford Brookes, looking at the adaptation of the intervention, but also some of the key issues that needed to be taken into account when implementing the intervention in a UK context. And what the team in Cardiff found was that actually there were quite a lot of implementation risks if you brought together groups of families who were experiencing very high levels of challenge. And that might be both in terms of meeting the support needs of those groups, but also actually trying to deliver what is quite a structured and tightly timed intervention. And they developed what they called a mixed families or 70-30 approach. And the aim of this was to form groups of between 5 and 12 families that were going to receive SFP. And within that group, around about 70% of the families would be those unlikely to experience or present challenges in a group setting. And the remaining 30% families who may experience or present those kinds of challenges. Examples of the kind of challenges we're talking about here are things like young people not attending school, possibly ADHD, low literacy levels, skills, and learning difficulties. So things that might make it difficult or harder for a young person or a family to be part of a group setting. So for instance, someone, a young person that had been, say, excluded from school might very well find it potentially difficult to be back in what was similar to a school environment in some ways. And this group composition mix, the 70-30 mix, was designed to maximize fidelity, so enable the program activities to be delivered as intended, to promote positive group dynamics and behavior change, and also to maximize retention. Here are the trial outcomes. We had two primary outcomes: the number of occasions that young people reported having drunk alcohol and having been drunk during the last 30 days. And both of those primary outcomes dichotomized as never and 1 to 2 times or more. We had a number of secondary outcomes, mainly relating to substance use here. So things like use of cannabis, weekly smoking, age of alcohol use initiation, and a number of other outcomes, all of which we selected and designed based on the intervention's theory of change and its logic model. And then we had other secondary outcomes, which included family functioning, parenting, peer pressure resistance skills in young people, well-being and stress, and then also some educational outcomes. And some of those secondary outcomes were what we might think of as hypothesized mediators of long-term outcomes. So aspects of family functioning that were hypothesized to then kind of lead protective factors to prevent substance misuse among young people at longer-term follow-up. This is what the study looked like in terms of the data collection. So the top left there, at a baseline, we undertook questionnaires with parents and young people. And during the actual delivery of the program, we had observation of program sessions. At 9 and 15 months past baseline, we undertook telephone interviews with parents. And then 24 months past baseline was our main follow-up, where we collected data via questionnaires with parents and young people, and we collected the primary outcomes from the young people at that time point. So that's a bit about the design, and now I'll move on to give you an overview of the process evaluation, where we looked at the implementation and the receipt of SFP 1014. The process evaluation assessed adherence to content and implementation requirements, so the extent to which key activities within the intervention were delivered. We looked at the number of programs that were organised, the extent of participant engagement, and also at the proportion of families that participated in SFP. We also looked at the recruitment of participants and the factors that affected recruitment. So really tried to be able to describe what was delivered and some of the key factors that affected and shaped implementation. To assess fidelity, we asked facilitators, the people delivering the program sessions, to complete score sheets for each program hour. And we had that data for 50 out of the 56 program runs that occurred. And we also had researchers observe sample of sessions to look at the reliability of facilitator reports of the coverage of activities. We used routine data from each program site on things like delivery dates, attendance, and things like uptake of childcare and transport by families. And then we had a series of qualitative interviews with SFP staff that explored implementation processes and the role also of contextual factors. In terms of the actual implementation of the program within the trial, each area, each county where the intervention was delivered, there was a local agency partnership, with one agency taking the lead and appointing a program coordinator. And staff from multiple local agencies trained as SFP facilitators and committed to facilitate the program during all 7 weeks of at least one program. So this was very much a multi-agency partnership led by one agency in each area. Families could come forward in response to awareness raising in the community, so anyone could apply and to take part in the program, part of the trial, but could also be referred by practitioners in local services. And the programs were delivered in schools and other community facilities with a target capacity of around 10 to 12 families per program. So I'll tell you now a little bit about what we found in the process evaluation. The first thing just to highlight is that within the trial, we recruited 715 families, and 361 of those were allocated to the intervention arm. And of the 56 program runs that occurred, 47 of those achieved the target group size, which was between 5 and 12 families. But relatively high number, around 60% of the individual sessions ran with quite small numbers, so fewer than 5 families. In the intervention arm, 80% of families attended at least one session, 60% were categorized as having received the intervention, so that's having attended 5 or more sessions, and 33% of them attended all 7 sessions. On their fidelity checklists, the facilitators rated participant engagement as high in virtually all of the activities. And we also found that there was no evidence that the presence of small groups sometimes affected families' engagement. So coming back to the group composition that I talked about a bit earlier on, so the mix of families with and without challenges within a group setting, 22 out of the 56 program runs fully achieved the target group composition, which was around about 70% of families without challenges and 30% with, but actually most of the remaining programs still achieved the correct mix of families. They were still in the correct direction. So it was often quite hard or almost impossible if you had depending on the numbers to hit 70% exactly, and that was never the intention. So actually broadly the programs did achieve this mix of families. There was good adherence to staffing levels, which was 3 or more facilitators in each session and the same staff across weeks 1 to 7. And in terms of fidelity, facilitators rated a high proportion, 96% of individual activities and sessions as mostly fully covered. There was some variation across trial sites, so varying from 90 to 99%. And broadly, the observation that researchers did, although the rates were slightly lower, and broadly kind of confirmed that fidelity was good. I'll move on now to talk a little bit about some of the findings from the qualitative data that helps to understand what was implemented and why. First thing to say is there was a significant commitment to the intervention from local agencies and delivery teams. SFP was welcomed as filling a gap, partly because it serves this 10 to 14-year-old age group, which I think certainly at the time there was less provision than for younger age groups, but also because it brought together parents and their children, whereas many other interventions were for parents or for children only. And practitioners thought that SFP benefited families by improving relationships and skills. And they also saw that SFP would help them in their own professional roles to actually achieve their kind of goals as professionals working with families. And this energized the local partnerships to incorporate SFP into everyday practice, sometimes by rearranging roles, creating dedicated responsibilities, and also providing resources where necessary. And the training that staff received to deliver the program was also praised because it gave them a really good understanding, not just of what they were expected to do, but of the program theory and its design. So understanding why things were in the program and why they were designed in the way that they were. In terms of the actual implementation of the program, there were some practical challenges. Some of these were, for instance, in relation to bringing together facilitators who may be quite disparate in terms of where they're based or from multiple organizations for the weekly preparation meetings before the sessions. And there did appear to be a link between coverage rates, so the extent to which activities were undertaken in the sessions, and the extent to which the preparation meetings were held as intended. And I think fair to say this was sort of part of a wider problem as time went on around facilitator recruitment and retention, and partly in the context of reduced capacity to release staff to deliver the program and following funding cuts in general. And the qualitative data from the interviews suggested initially that fidelity to the staffing standards, so the kind of consistency and levels of staffing might be low. But when we looked at the quantitative data, it indicated the opposite. And so this is quite an interesting example, I think, of where the qualitative and the quantitative data help you to look in new ways at each data set. So what we found when we looked in a bit more detail is that actually some of the agencies that were involved in delivery had to be quite resourceful and flexible. And what they did, for instance, was to rely more on staff in their own agencies and to make the requirements workable. So although there were these challenges, they were able to adjust and sometimes by drawing more on their own staff. But multi-agency staffing appeared to be better in two areas where the program coordinators were in post throughout the trial. So that sense of consistency in staffing was helpful. Recruitment and retention, I think fair to say, was a major challenge, and all of the program coordinators reported difficulties in recruiting families to the trial. To some extent, that might have been because they were recruiting to a universal intervention and recruiting from the general population, which in some cases differed from recruiting from a defined client group, or certainly having more targeted recruitment, which might have been the norm in some cases. And sometimes the coordinators' contacts were mainly with other agencies, primarily concerned with supporting vulnerable and groups with high levels of need, rather than kind of universal groups. The other issue, of course, was that this was a randomized controlled trial, so the teams were recruiting to a trial with half the families allocated to receive SFP, and some professionals were reluctant to refer families because those being allocated to the control group would obviously not receive Strengthening Families program for the time that they were in the trial. So to summarize the key points from the process evaluation, SFP was delivered with good fidelity. There were high levels of adherence to program content, but some variation in each the study sites. The targets on the group composition were not always exactly achieved, but most groups comprised a mix of families with and without challenges in a group setting that was in line with the ethos of that model. High levels of adherence and engagement suggested that variations in group composition and size didn't impact significantly on the delivery of the program or group dynamic. And there were high levels of commitment towards the program among practitioners, which appeared to have a positive influence on fidelity. Overall, that the program was workable in terms of its delivery, but levels of multi-agency staffing capacity reduced during the trial. And recruitment was a key challenge, with concerns about randomization and universal provision and reducing the potential number of referrals from some agencies. I'll move on then to take you through the main findings from the trial, and starting off with the trial recruitment and retention. And for some of the slides here, I'm not going to go through all of the numbers. I'll try and pick out some of the key messages. But at the very top here, you can see that in this the chart that we recruited 715 families. which comprised 931 young people and 919 parents or carers, so PC. And two figures that I just want to highlight at the bottom in the bottom two boxes is that a 24-month follow-up where we collected our main primary outcomes from young people, we were able to collect data from 78% of the young people in the control arm, that's the bottom left-hand box, and then in the intervention box, bottom right, 85% of the young people from the intervention arm. So a bit of a difference, but not huge, and we managed to retain pretty high numbers of young people across both arms of the trial. Here are the baseline characteristics for the whole sample, and the key take-home message from this slide is that at baseline there were no differences of major note between the trial arms. So we had very similar, comparable control and intervention groups at baseline. And as I mentioned earlier on, we had two primary outcomes that related to alcohol use by young people. So we asked our participants on how many occasions in the last 30 days have you drunk alcohol? And that was a 24-month follow-up. And that outcome was dichotomized for the primary analysis. And then we also undertook a number of, at the bottom of the slide here, shows you the some of the statistical analysis procedures that we used. We undertook secondary analyses of the alcohol use primary outcomes, and for instance, controlling for gender. We looked at it as an ordinal outcome, fully adjusted, and as an ordinal outcome, unadjusted, and a number of other secondary analyses that were pre-specified and included in our protocol. And then we also undertook a series of subgroup analyses for the alcohol use primary outcome. For instance, the age of the young person, the baseline, gender, the smoking behaviour of the young person, and so on. So I won't read through all of these, but it's just to give you a sense of how we planned to look at these data. And then for the drunkenness primary outcome, a very similar approach was used. The question was, on how many occasions in the last 30 days have you been drunk? Again, it was dichotomized for the primary analysis. Again, we had pre-specified methods around the statistical analysis. And again, we had in the same subgroup and secondary analyses. And here are the findings for the primary outcomes. And the key point to highlight here is that there was no evidence of a between-group difference on either of the primary outcomes of having been having drunk alcohol in the last 30 days or having been drunk in the last 30 days. And those conclusions were unaltered when we did our various pre-planned adjusted analyses, when we looked at non-receipt of the intervention, and when we made adjustments for missing data. So two groups, very similar, and no evidence of a between-group difference on either of the primary outcomes. There was no strong evidence of differential intervention effects according to the pre-planned subgroup analyses, some potential differential effects according to baseline parenting skills as perceived by the young people, and also the family categorization in relation to families with or without challenges in a group setting, but nothing here that changed the conclusion here of there not being a difference between the two groups. And then moving on to the secondary outcomes, at 24 months, no evidence of between group differences in any of the other substance use outcomes, which included alcohol-related problems, repeat smoking, cannabis use, and time to alcohol, tobacco, and drug use initiation, all of which were young people reported. And similarly for the parenting and family-based outcomes, some borderline evidence of better parenting and family-based outcomes for those randomized to SFP, but very small, and in most cases not statistically significant. And again, nothing that actually changes the overall conclusion here. And then moving on to the other secondary outcomes, there was some borderline evidence that the odds of reporting full health using the EQ5D was actually lower than those, was lower in those randomized to SFP, mostly due to differences in the anxiety, depression, and pain and discomfort domains, but again, very small differences, and in most cases, no difference between the group. And for all of the other secondary outcomes, again, no evidence of a between group difference in relation to things like antisocial and prosocial behavior of peers, strengths and difficulties, self-efficacy, security and attachment, and family expressiveness. But one thing that I just wanted to explore a little bit before I move on to some conclusions is to come back to this family categorization, where we were including in the trial families identified as potentially having or presenting or having some challenges in a group setting, and those without. Now, in this slide and the next one, this was not pre-planned analysis, so this was exploratory analyses, and just to stress that in almost all cases, these were not statistically significant. There appears to be some kind of potential patterning going on here. So this data here shows you the outcomes there, alcohol and drunk alcohol and drunkenness, weekly smoking, cannabis use ever in the last 12 months, and cannabis use in the last 30 days. And this is the data just for the families identified as being without challenges in a group setting. And the blue bars are the control group, and the orange is SFP. And what you can see is that across these outcomes, the rates of those behaviours are slightly lower in the control group compared to the SFP group. So in other words, in favour of the control group. But then when you look at the families with challenges in a group setting, what you find is that that direction is reversed. And actually the rates, again, not statistically significant in the vast majority of cases, but the actual direction is reversed. And there's sort of a hint here that the outcomes might be better for those in the SFP group. And at about the same time that we were undertaking our trial in Wales, there were a number of other European trials, and those have taken place in Germany, Poland, and Sweden. And interestingly, very much mirror the findings of our trial in Wales. Most, I think, those trials actually finding similarly to us, not finding significant differences between intervention and control groups. So in other words, not actually replicating the findings from the trials in the United States. In Germany and Poland, certainly from my reading, the adaptations that have been made to the US, the original US version of the programme, are broadly similar to those undertaken in the UK, and we might argue have observed the underlying kind of content and mechanisms of the intervention. And the Swedish adaptation made quite major changes to the intervention, and so there's a question there, I guess, around whether the effectiveness or the lack of effectiveness there, to what extent that might be because of some of the changes made to the intervention. So to sum up, overall, we found no evidence of any differences on any of the young person reported substance use outcomes at 24 months. We found that the intervention was delivered with good fidelity in terms of the coverage of activities, staffing provision, and group dynamics. There was some evidence, albeit small differences, which were not statistically significant, but there were some positive effects around some of the parenting skills and parent-child bonding and family cohesion and family conflict outcomes, and some evidence, again, albeit small differences, that SFP had a negative effect on health-related quality of life in young people and parents at 24 months, mostly driven by differences in levels of anxiety or depression. No evidence of any differences in terms of antisocial and prosocial behavior, behavioral difficulties, self-efficacy, security and attachment, and family expressiveness. And some evidence, and again, mostly there's exploratory analyses and not statistically significant, that suggest that SFP may have been beneficial for families with challenges, but possibly harmful for families without challenges in a group setting. I've listed here so that you can come back to them at your leisure, the main trial publications, including our protocol, the main findings paper, the process evaluation paper, and a commentary that we wrote on the Swedish adaptation of SFP 1014. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, our funders, the MPRI and the support from Welsh Government and others, and also in particular to send our sincere thanks to the practitioners and organisations that delivered the intervention and the families who took part in the research. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these very interesting findings. And now there is space for remarks, discussion, and you could just raise your hand or write down something in the chat. I think everyone is still thinking. Richard.
I would hate to disappoint you, Gallus. I'd hate to disappoint you. Gosh, Jeremy, thank you. What a fantastically well-designed and well-organized pragmatic RCT. That is absolutely amazing. It looks to me, sounds to me like a textbook definition of how to go about doing something stunningly complicated. And the amount of juggling of people and organizations and everything that you and colleagues must have had to do is, well, for those of us in this work, we understand, I think, how huge that activity must have been. So major congratulations. Obviously, I've got a lot of questions, but I'll only ask one or two now and then come back later if other people don't. I mean, I suppose the thing I'm obviously most challenged by is why it didn't work. This is a program which works in the US, it appears, from a great deal of research that's been done there by Spot and others. It's a sensible program. It makes a great deal of sense about why it should work. And yet you've demonstrated that basically, I mean, we can scrabble around and find some, things which we can say, yes, there are some differences here if we look hard enough. But in general, it doesn't appear to have worked. And so I'm interested in your view about what you think is going on. That's the first question. And the second one is, I wonder if there's any sort of conceptual relationship between this and Project Match and UCAT, where, again, we had a pretty good theoretical set of reasons for thinking that some interventions might be more effective for some people, and large RCTs failed to demonstrate any difference. So two questions. Why do you think this didn't work? And do you think there's something about doing large RCTs on things which people think are going to work, which don't work, which we could learn from.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your comments at the start. I suppose I'll preface what I'm going to say now by saying these are my views. So I'm not sort of speaking on behalf of the whole team now, but yeah, I mean, it's obviously something that we've spent a lot of time reflecting on, because, as you say, there's a very extensive evidence base for the intervention. It's theoretically based and well designed. I think there's two things that I would argue are probably not the reason we didn't find effectiveness. I think the first of those is the implementation. So we know that it was implemented well, and I guess that in a sense made the process of evaluation even more important, because actually we were able to say it's not because it's not been delivered. You know, the intervention has been delivered. The other thing, and I was reviewing literature on this recently, my sense is that it was well adapted. I'm not personally, I don't think it's an adaptation failure, if you like. So then there's a couple of other sort of potential reasons. One could be, I suppose, that what usual practice is or normal care is in Wales in 2015 or Germany in 2015 is different to what it was where the original trials were undertaken. So in a sense, is it that actually the control here is different to the control that they were using in the Midwest of the United States? And of course, also there's the time, there's a time interval as well. The other thing that I guess I'm really interested in is, and this I'm asking this as a question really, is it possible that, to your second question, that the intervention interacts differently with families with different levels of need? So is it possible that actually it could be an effective program for families who are experiencing, who have higher levels of need, and less effective families with lower levels of need? The only kind of issue there, I suppose, is could you run it as a highly targeted program, and might there then be kind of iatrogenic effects in terms of stigmatization and other issues? So, and then I guess finally, I mention it as an independent observer. I guess some of the trials in the United States have been criticised for their methodological rigor. I mean, I suppose that's something that the authors have very robustly defended. But I guess I'm particularly interested in how the intervention interacts in these different contexts with different levels of need and so forth. So I don't know that I've answered your question, but maybe I've put out a few possibilities there.
Then Liz.
Hello. I actually worked in one of the teams in Carmarthenshire in the substance misuse team. I wasn't part of the programme, but I was sort of programme adjacent. So I saw lots of things that were going on. And it's just really interesting to kind of hear this end of it. And I think I don't know if it's a question, but a comment more, that I think everybody who was involved with it and the people around it spoke really highly of the programme and actually thought, there was a lot of positives, and found that was something really good for families to have that chance to bring together. And I think often people spoke about like that time apart and then together, and the time that was taken over the parenting groups was really positive. To add that really. But then I suppose when we've done, and not to the level of research, but we've done some parenting programs then separately for parents with drug and alcohol issues, being together with a group without the challenge, everybody there had challenges and things they were dealing with. Actually, people they said they could speak quite freely and they could talk about things that they wanted to, and they didn't feel that level of stigma and shame. And I wonder whether there's any sort of thought about, by having that combined group, that's a good thing because you kind of, bring lots of different people together, but there's a risk then that people maybe didn't or couldn't get everything out of it that they wanted. So that was just a wonder I had more than a question. So I don't know.
And by combined, you mean the mixed group?
Yes, that 70-30 aspect of it.
I think one of my reflections is that maybe traditionally we've focused, I say we, not you, we focused too much on the delivery of the content to these kind of group-based interventions. And the more you look at it, I guess, the more, in the way you've just described, the interaction between participants is really important. It's also really complicated. So I can see how actually what you're saying there is it maybe there's people coming from quite different perspectives. That might be a good thing. But equally, if you bring together families that have a kind of a more shared experience, I guess that could be good in the sense of kind of support. But equally, there could also be issues around how you deliver a program like this, which is very tightly timed. So that's my first thought, is that maybe the group dynamics are a really important aspect of this for the reasons you mentioned. I suppose the other thing is that, and I'm not a trial statistician, so I must be careful what I say here, but I suppose what we looked at whether overall the outcomes were better for the control group versus the intervention. So I'm guessing there will be families where it has been beneficial. But what we were looking at, I suppose, is that, you know, overall at this kind of like population level, and maybe the two aspects of that are kind of linked. So, and also I guess my sense also is that, you know, the intervention is well designed. It's not, I don't think it's not worked here because it's badly designed or badly thought through. It's clearly been, you know, kind of theoretically informed and carefully put together. Yeah.
Okay. I also have one question. But first of all, I hand over to Jim.
All right. Thank you. Jeremy, first of all, thank you very much, both for the excellence of the work, but also the great clarity of your presentation. I mean, it was very, very clear from start to finish. So thank you so much for that. I've got a couple of questions. One is you talked about some people presenting challenges, but they weren't challenges to do with the young people's substance use particularly, were they? So, and I'd like to know a little bit more about how people were selected or selected themselves for taking part in the trial, because I didn't hear you say anything that really suggested to me that these were particularly people at risk. The young people were at risk, or these were already families who were particularly worried about substance use. So that was one thing. And the other thing, you mentioned it having a very clear theoretical basis, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. I mean, what was it about the program and what happened in the program that it was thought would make a contribution to preventing the young people's substance misuse?
Yeah, well, thanks again for your comments. That's much appreciated, and those great questions. Shall I start with the second one? I'm a little bit rusty on the specific and individual bodies of kind of theory, but I guess my description of the intervention in that way is from having looked at the way the program targets risk and protective factors, which are informed by the theoretical literature. So, in other words, all of the activities map onto that, and there are various publications that set out, I suppose, how the activities are designed to set in motion those protective factors. So one could be, I guess, around looking at reducing parental stress. Another one could be around expressing emotion, that kind of thing. So I suppose it's the strength, as I would see it, is that the overall program is informed by the literature on how family relationships parenting and young people's skills are protective factors against later substance misuse, and then how the individual activities are designed to trigger those mechanisms, if you like. So I don't know whether does that answer your second question. I'm not sure I've quite done it justice, but
yes, I mean, it may be, we need this would require a much longer discussion, but
yeah,
I can see risk and protective factors as part of the theory, but I suppose I'd be interested to know more, maybe now is not the occasion, but to know more about why it was thought that what went on in those sessions would actually alter those risk factors.
Yeah, I think what I would say, and going back to Liz's point around, it's partly around, I suppose, the interaction between parents and their children and kind of improving communication. Alongside that, it's also around developing young people's and parents' skills, so that they've got the skills to engage in that kind of communication. But I might need to come back to you with some of the more detailed theoretical frameworks and how they're designed to be kind of how the activities set off those mechanisms. In terms of the first point, I guess this was around what we mean by challenges and then the recruitment. I think that's what you were asking about. So the first thing I think you asked was how was it identified whether a family had challenges? And one of the things that would always happen, be it within the trial or during routine delivery, is that the program coordinator would meet with each family, and that would be around whether or not the family had referred themselves or had been referred. The coordinator would explore with them a bit about what the program would involve, what the family was hoping to get out of it, and also part of that meeting would look at whether there were any aspects of the program they might find challenging. So that covers quite a wide range of issues, really. So it might be something around someone that has low literacy levels, and bearing in mind that the program does use a lot of written materials, it would therefore be important to work with the parent to say, or the young person to say, well, what help and support might you need? What might you not need? Or it could be, for instance, that actually where relationships between a parent and a child are quite strained or difficult, there might need to be some support there to help them to work together. So they're really a kind of they're a different sort of collection of things. But as you said, they're not about risk. They're not about need or risk in a general sense. But one of the things that we have done in our analyses is to look at the overall kind of, if you like, risk profile within the trial population. And there is quite a high there is quite a lot of variation in levels of overall need and risk. So although this group composition is an implementation strategy rather than trying to reach particular parts of the population, it kind of suggests that it does reach families with differing levels of need and differing levels of risk. But it's an important distinction, which is I'm glad you've mentioned.
Okay, so I also have got two questions. One is just for curiosity. Since you dichotomized most of the outcomes on substance use, I just wonder if you had a look also on the non-dichotomized outcomes, since well, probably, just consuming yes or no might be part of a rather normal exploratory behavior in juveniles. So I just wonder if probably severity might have been impacted by the program by any means. And the other question is, I also am curious to hear a bit more how you managed to collect data in controls who received nothing.
So if I take the first question first, and I'm with a caveat that the trial statistician is not here, so I might need to refer you to him. But the answer to your question is yes, we did look at the data as an ordinal outcome. I think that's the right term, isn't it? So so when we made the decisions to dichotomize, we also pre-specified that we'd look at it non-dichotomized, and it made no difference. So we were able to kind of answer exactly that question. The second question is, I suppose, that was what gave us all sleepless nights. Was once you've recruited people into a trial like this, how do you retain them? I suppose one thing to say is that it wasn't that they received nothing; it was that they didn't receive SFP 1014. So, but I guess as a family, you may well feel, that you hadn't got what it was that was being offered. We did a number of things. It was really challenging. We had 9 and 15-month follow-ups with parents by phone, and what we tried to do is to say, what is the most important data? The most important data for us was the 24-month outcome data from young people, because it was the primary outcomes. And so at 9 and 15 months, if parents were sort of felt that we were maybe asking for too much data, or we tried, I guess what I'm saying is we would always want to try and keep the family in the study and skip 9-month data collection, rather than try and prioritize 9-month data collection and then lose parents and young people at 24 months. And if you look at our data completion rates, you'll see that they dip in the middle, I think, and that actually our 24-month is what we prioritized in terms of if parents or were feeling kind of doubts about providing the data, we would say, well, okay, can we come back to you though with further 24 months? So I'm not explaining it very well, but we essentially prioritized that. The other thing that we did was we had, and I've got to say, fantastic support from the local agencies. So we did quite a lot of work to kind of find people if they moved house or that kind of thing. But we were very lucky in that respect. And I think one of my reflections is that it's actually really hard to do these kind of trials out in community settings, and there's quite a lot of skills that you need as a researcher to do trials in settings that are not normally delivering services as part of a trial. So for me, I learned a lot about it and how best to run a trial within that kind of setting. But that was how we managed to reach, I think, more families that follow up, is that we tried to reduce the burden of the interim follow-ups and keep people in the study.
Okay, thanks. Richard, you're muted.
I am now no longer muted. I did say I have a lot of questions, but I won't put too many, but just two follow-up ones, really. One of them is, you already mentioned that one of the reasons why you might have got different results from the US is because of the difference in control conditions. And you've just mentioned control again here, in that you said the families didn't get nothing. Were you able, you may have said this already and I might have forgotten it, but were you able to measure properly what the control groups got? And obviously, I imagine, I know that Wales is far ahead in lots of ways, but I imagine there was considerable variety over the areas in terms of intervention as normal. And were any of the variations in what people got, did that help you understand the lack of difference? So in some places, did people get a great deal as treatment as normal? So there's almost no difference between that and strengthening families. And in other places, did they get almost nothing? And did that cause any difference? So that's the first question. And the second one is following up from Jim's question about, you said that the theoretical work and the activities and so on were all designed to improve things like communication and parenting skills, which theoretically would mean that they would have had a positive impact on outcome. Did you measure at all, though? Did you test whether people's skills and their behaviour did change? Or did you just test whether the interventions were delivered, which you assumed would lead to those outcomes?
Taking the first question first, yes, we did. We measured, we looked at service use across the two arms, and I would have to go away and look at the detail, but the broad answer is they were very similar. So there was nothing in the data there that suggested that the lack of intervention effect was due to compensatory provision of services. So the two arms were comparable in terms of, and I'd have to kind of refresh myself on it.
When you say the two arms are comparable, do you mean the two arms that the control groups got similar things, or do you mean that actually what the control group got was actually quite similar to what Strengthening Families got?
No, sorry, I meant the former, that actually take SOP 1014 out of the equation. The normal care was comparable across the two trial arms,
right,
into which for the intervention arm you're adding SOP 1014.
So was normal care very different to Strengthening Families?
That's a question.
Because obviously, if it was actually extremely good quality care that was being delivered across Wales at that time, then you wouldn't expect to find a difference because everyone was getting something similar.
I would say it was distinctive, and it was distinctive for a number of reasons. One is that there wasn't. I'm not quite familiar with what's provided, but there was relatively little for young people in this 10 to 14 age group, much more for younger children, and also there was very little that brought together parents and young people. So that I would say
there's a clear space between them.
And the other thing that I guess that we could say there is that the qualitative data helped us to understand that, and actually most of the agencies were attracted to the intervention because it was distinctive and because it was meeting this kind of need. Not having said that, but I suppose what normal care is in Wales might be very different to what was normal care in Iowa, and I guess also the more general kind of the welfare state, for want of a better word, might be quite different too. So it's interesting that our results are mirrored or very similar across Germany, Poland, Sweden. So there are questions there, aren't there, about actually what is being provided more generally in terms of health and welfare and education, and I think those are important questions. Your second question, we didn't assess skill development at program end. So I guess you could say that's a limitation. What we did was we looked at those hypothesized mediators around family relationships and parenting at 9 and 15 months. So I suppose there's a question there around skill development, but everything that you'll see in the process evaluation suggests that the intervention's been delivered as intended, and certainly from our observation, people were engaging in it in a manner that you would expect it. So for my money, I wouldn't have thought I wouldn't have thought it's that the skills haven't been learned. I think for me, maybe it's more that broader interaction between the intervention and family context, possibly.
Well, then a final question from me. Where do we go to from here in trying to think about developing interventions to help young people not to get involved in substance misuse?
Okay, so a nice easy question to and a really good question. I've got two initial thoughts. One is around, I think what the process taught me was the real how vital it is that actually we have kind of intervention policy development and research working in tandem. We were very lucky. We had very important support from Welsh Government. So actually kind of ensuring that we embed evaluation in intervention design, but also that our evaluations are actually able to be undertaken in community settings as one. The second point, I guess that's a more difficult one, because there's nothing here that you could say about the intervention which feels like it's inherently flawed, or it feels like it's almost like a strength issue, if you like. So I wonder if it's about not just about intervention mechanisms and design, but actually about how they're delivered within the population. So is it about me bringing together interventions and understanding the context in which they're being delivered? So that's not taking us all the way to answer your question, but I guess maybe is it about, as much as whether is an intervention effective, maybe we also need to be asking in what contexts are interventions effective and for who. And I'm sure that there are mechanisms within this intervention that that are effective, but in this particular configuration, it's not had the effects that we would perhaps have wanted to see.
Thank you. As Liz says, perhaps what we need to do is have a discussion with young people themselves about what works for them.
I think that's a really great point, and certainly within our research centre in Decipher, we have we would always want to start with involving the public, whether that be young people or parents, and actually understanding what their needs are, and doing that in bringing that lived experience into intervention, development, and design. So yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Okay, there is also another question by Jim.
Yes, following up on that point, Jeremy, about engaging the public, I just wonder how the results have gone down with people. I mean, have you had a chance to hear from all the stakeholders, in this, complicated and excellent piece of work? I mean, it's obviously taken quite a long time to do and involved really quite a lot of people. I mean, all the way down from the Welsh Government, sort of down to the people who took part and other people. Has there been a possibility to gauge their reaction? I mean, have people said, right, well, that's the end of Strengthening Families programme then, we know it doesn't work in Wales, end of story, hopefully someone will come up with something better in the course of time. Or, have some of the families, if asked, who've taken part, said, yeah, but I don't understand why you've got negative results. You must have been asking the wrong questions, because really taking part in your programme changed our lives in our family. I mean, our family has really not been the same since. It was a wonderful thing to take part. Thank you so much for it. I mean, what do people say when you tell them, after all this work, the results are negative?
Yes. One of the main kind of emotions is disappointment. I mean, I suppose I as a researcher, you evaluate things and you try and evaluate them robustly and fairly. And here you've got an intervention that's been well designed, well implemented, and yet this is the outcome. So I guess what we're not saying here, we're not saying it hasn't helped some families. What we're saying is when you look at the two trial arms, overall the results are not significantly better for the intervention arm. So that is a real challenge, I guess, when you're trying to look at, well, some families may well say the things you said, but actually we're looking at it at this kind of this overall level. I think it's challenging. It's challenging to spend 5-6 years doing this kind of trial, and then to have these results. And I'm sure it's very challenging for the teams that deliver the intervention and worked hard to then sort of hear these results. And I guess I'm not sure that I have an easy answer for that, really, other than disappointment, I would have thought. because there's nothing that to hear from it to suggest that it's because it's been implemented poorly. It's actually been implemented very well, and some families, I'm sure, will have benefited individually.
Okay. Are there any further questions? I don't see anything in the comment, and it's been quite a lively debate. So I would like to thank you very much once more for your brilliant talk and well-structured. And although results have been rather disappointing, I guess this is also what research is about. So once more, thank you very much. As you have seen, at the same time, we had 3 responses in the chat. So this webinar will be available rather soon on the AFINet website. So if you have any colleagues who missed this talk, just tell them to watch the webinar there. I also would like to announce the next webinars that will be, the next one will be on Tuesday, the 8th of November, about mothers' experiences of caregiving for their adult children with substance use disorders by Dr. Una Sant-Amand from Toronto. And then there'll be another webinar on Tuesday, the 13th of December, on affected family members of disordered gamblers during the COVID-19 pandemic in Italy during the lockdown. Next year, we will switch to a bi-monthly format of the webinars, and these will be regularly announced on the website. And check out for our call for abstracts regarding the upcoming conference in June. And of course, we would like to meet you all there in person. And I guess it's also not a long way from Wales to Rotterdam. So we would, of course, welcome to see you there as well, Jeremy. But for today, thank you very much. And I wish you all a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you hugely. Bye-bye all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.